Now, let's talk about techniques of motivic improvisation. The techniques of motivic improvisation, such as repetition, transposition, expansion, interpolation, contraction, fragmentation, inversion, retrograde, and retrograde inversion, are innately connected with the art of composition. The underlying premise of motivic improvisation is to take a small melodic gesture, called a motive, and transform it in a logical, coherent, and musically satisfying manner. The use of motivic development lends coherence to improvisation. There are certain characteristics that a motive should have in order to be developmental and in order to be used in improvisation. First of all, the motive should have a strong rhythmic profile, an interesting melodic shape, a clear harmonic definition, and a relatively short duration. These are, of course, broad and very generic characteristics, but things get a little bit more interesting when you start improvising on a tune, like Charlie's composition, or Tyrone's, or Daniel's. Then you have a specific tune to work with, from which you can generate motives that are similar in design to the original melody. The tune that you're working with might give you some ideas for transformations. Not only will that process establish a much stronger bond with the composition, but also will be in keeping with the tune you're improvising on. Before Charlie demonstrates the use of motivic development, let me briefly describe and demonstrate different techniques of motivic development. First of all, repetition. Repetition is probably the easiest technique from our list, but we can have a little bit fun with that technique. The repetition can be exact or inexact. Even though exact repetition might be redundant, it can be very effective in certain contexts, as, for instance, for giving a new melodic emphasis or confirming certain melodic ideas that you want to prioritize in your line. Inexact repetition involves slight pitch or rhythmic modification of the original motive, but only minor adjustments to the original motive. Let's work on a specific motive. Here's our motive derived from the C Dorian mode. Okay. So let's first talk about the intervallic content. It's really important to do a little bit of analysis so you know how to come up with intervallic inversions, retrograde, and so forth. So we have +5, and by the way, you can see that motive on the screen. +5 means +5 semitones, so minor perfect fourth, -3, minor third down, +5, +5, fourths, and minor third down. That's the original motive. Now, the transposition. The technique of transposition transfers the original motive to a different pitch level. There are two types of transpositions, modal and real. So if this is our original motive, and that motive is in C Dorian, upon transposition to a different pitch level, we have to preserve the underlying modality of the motive. So if you transpose it to the third, starting on E flat, we have to adjust our intervals in order to be compliant with the underlying modality. C Dorian in that case. Right? So instead of plus 5, we have plus 6 at the beginning and then 4 down. Real transposition, on the other hand, preserves the exact intervallic content of the original motive. So most likely you're going to encounter chromatic pitches when you start applying real transposition. So again, our original motive, real transpositions preserves the intervallic content of the original. Right? So if we are in C Dorian, right, real transposition introduces chromatic notes. That's a very nice way of dealing with chromatic content of your lines. You preserve the contour of your original motive and then introduce chromatic pitches in keeping with the original intervallic content of the motive. The next two techniques, expansion and interpolation. These techniques add new material to the original motive. Expansions add something new at the end of the motive. So for instance, our original motive, motivic expansion. So you can add a little bit tail at the end. So expand the original motive. And the technique of interpolation adds something new in the middle of that motive. So we added 4 notes and we return to the original. So both techniques expand the original motive. Now, conversely, contraction and fragmentation are motivic techniques that shorten the length of the motive and use part of the motive in a developmental fashion. So contraction, as the name suggests, is particularly useful with longer motivic ideas. And it shortens the length of the original motive. So if our original motive is, we can shorten it, right? We can shorten it to like just 4 notes instead of the original 6. And fragmentation then takes the salient ideas of the original motive and then develops them within a line. So for instance, fragmentation, original motive, and fragmentation. Right? So we took the first 3 notes and we transposed it to come up with much longer melodic lines. So you can see once you start understanding the principles behind these motivic techniques, you can start combining them and creating longer melodic statements. But again, I cannot stress enough the importance of thinking more compositionally about your solo. And the techniques of motivic development will definitely bring that coherence into your playing. Now the next technique, inversion, is a little bit more complicated because it involves mirroring the intervals of the original motive. So just as in transposition, there are 2 types of inversions, real and tonal. Real inversion preserves the exact intervallic content of the original motive in inversion, and as a result, chromatic pitches will likely occur in the transformed form of that motive. Tonal inversion preserves the tonal modal context in which the original motive is situated. So as a result, we will encounter minor intervallic adjustments to preserve the underlying modality or tonality. Okay, so our original motive. So now the importance of analyzing its intervallic content. So plus 5 semitones. In modal inversion, and then real inversion preserves the exact intervallic content. So original, you can hear these techniques are very much related. Modal inversion, on the other hand, doesn't sound the same because we have to adjust the underlying intervals to preserve the Dorian foundation of that motif. Even more complex technique, which you can experiment with, but it's definitely useful in composition, is the technique of retrograde. And this technique renders the original motif backwards with the change of interval direction, or with intervallic complementation, or with intervallic inverses. Let me unpack this complicated statement. So a minor third down becomes a minor third up, or a major sixth down, because minor third and major sixth are complementary intervals. But we have to be mindful of the direction of these intervals. All right? And remember, we'll read the original motif backwards. So original. So if our original motif has minor third down at the end, the opening interval is minor third up. That's your retrograde. So when you listen to these two motifs side by side, kind of complementary, because you're basically reading the original backwards, and its close companion, retrograde to inversion. So this technique renders the original motif backwards, but with the same intervals as the original motif. So if the last interval is a minor third down, the first interval of retrograde inversion is exactly the same. It's minor third down, or major sixth up, to be mindful of the contour characteristics. So here's our original motif, and here's retrograde inversion. You see how closely related these motifs are. And again, the technique of inversion, retrograde, and retrograde inversion are great improvisational devices, a bit more complex and intricate, but they're particularly important in composition. So as I mentioned before, with inversion, retrograde, and retrograde inversions, you have to do some practice, but it's doable. But with other techniques that we've discussed earlier, transposition, fragmentation, repetition, and others, you can add much needed coherence in your playing and begin thinking about the process of improvisation with this as kind of extension of composition. So for great improvisers, there is not too much difference between what is improvised and what is composed.